Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Whitney Kosters. I'm a professor of English, and today I'm going to explain, summarize, and help you understand Roland Barthes' famous essay, The Death of the Author. If you're an English major or if you're taking a literature class, there's a good chance you'll be asked to read this essay because it changed the way people talk about reading, interpretation, and authorship. I also think Barthes brings up ideas that are useful for anyone who reads with attention, because when you read, you are doing far more than simply receiving information from a writer. You are ingesting the material, thinking about it, questioning it, interpreting it, and bringing your own experience to what is actually on the page. Then someone may come along and tell you that your interpretation is wrong because that is not what the author intended for you to think. In this lecture, I'm going to give you a way to think through that claim because the role of the reader is so much more important than I think a lot of students are taught to believe. For context, I have been teaching literature at the college level for over 2 decades, and I always assign this essay in my literature classes because I want my students to understand that they have a real say in the meaning of a text. So if you're interested in getting easy, free help with the analysis of literature, writing, research, and rhetoric, be sure to subscribe to my channel and join me here in this new YouTube venture of mine. In a nutshell, Barthes is associated with structuralism and post-structuralism, but the version you need for this essay is fairly simple. Texts do not come out of nowhere. They are made from language, genres, symbols, stories, references, and ideas that were already in circulation before any single writer began writing. And because of that, our understanding of a text depends on all kinds of other things we know, including the ideas and traditions that influence the text in the first place. So since no one text begins from absolute originality, Barthes asks why we give one person, the author, full authority over it. The author is not necessarily the creator in the way we often imagine. He or she is arranging, managing, and putting together ideas that already exist into a more interesting, intriguing, newer, or compelling form. Barthes writes, "We now know that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash." If you've ever said, "It's all been done before," then Barthes would probably agree with you in some sense. But think about all the ideas, books, films, songs, poems, essays, and arguments that are still being produced every day. These creations are made from older materials, older forms, older stories, and older ways of thinking, but they can still become something powerful and worth reading. Now that leads us to his main point, which is a major obstacle that holds a lot of readers back is the assumption that the author maintains full control over the meaning of his or her writing. Have you ever been in class and said something like, "I think this character is using the metaphor to call attention to feminist concerns," only to be told by your instructor or another student that this interpretation can't work because the author was a misogynist? Well, that certainly stops the conversation pretty quickly, doesn't it? Or maybe you find yourself needing to know information about the author, like his or her political attitudes, beliefs, values, or circumstances, before you feel like you can make any real meaning of a text. Now, certainly context and biography can be very helpful, especially when they give us historical conditions or references we would otherwise miss. But Barthes is concerned with what happens when that information starts making all the decisions for us. So this is why Barthes uses an extreme word such as tyrannically when he says, "The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author." What you need to understand is the power and control that we so often grant the author is a relatively modern habit, and it stems from points in history that began to revere the individual more intensely. You have to keep in mind that many older texts circulated anonymously, and even as late as the 19th century, if you picked up a novel by Jane Austen, for instance, it might not say "by Jane Austen." It might have no author listed, or it would say something like "by the author of Pride and Prejudice," and you still might not know who that person was. You just knew that you did or didn't like the earlier book, and then you based your interest in the new one on that. Now, though, we are incredibly invested in the author, and we have the means to find out practically everything we want to know with a simple Google search. That is something to be very careful with, especially when author information starts narrowing what we allow ourselves to see. Barthes warns us that knowing too much biographical information can set us up for a misleading or limiting interpretation. For instance, if we learn that Van Gogh struggled with mental illness during a certain period of his life, we may begin to read certain paintings only through that story, even though the paintings themselves give us much more to consider. For Barthes, then, when we put the author up on a pedestal, we devalue the significant role we play as readers. We make meaning in the act of reading, and that meaning changes as readers, cultures, attitudes, and circumstances change. So this is why Barthes ends with the idea that the birth of the reader must come at the cost of the death of the author. Once the work is in the hands of readers, the author loses full control over interpretation. The text may still have an author in a historical sense, of course, but that author can no longer function as the final judge of what the text means. Think about the problems we create for ourselves if we allow the author to control the text completely. Authors are human, so while they may intend one thing while writing a text, they could change their minds later. They may also genuinely not know everything their own writing is doing. And if that's the case, which intention or interpretation should we accept as true, best, or correct? What if the author explains her intention years later, but there's no evidence for that intention in the text itself? What if the text you're reading was written anonymously and you can't identify the author? What if the author left no notes on the text and died 300 years ago? Does that mean the text's meaning died with him and the point of reading his work disappeared with it? You run into quite a number of problems when you give the author full control. I mean, one of the wonderful aspects of literature and art in general is that the meaning and enjoyment of it can change depending on the circumstances under which you are reading it. Consider how the context of your situation affects the way you interact with a text. Perhaps you have an English teacher that you just don't particularly like. If that teacher forces you to read a novel, your attitude toward the teacher may influence the way you approach the book, right? Or think about how much you've grown in the past 10 years and how much your life and your perspective have changed. You might read Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich as an invincible 20-year-old, and I'll bet you read that same story much differently as a 90-year-old approaching death. Nothing about the story changed, you did. Your perspective and circumstances changed. So, when I teach literature, I try to help my students see how approaching literature through different critical lenses can significantly change the meaning of a text. For example, reading Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, through a feminist lens creates a much different discussion than reading it through a psychoanalytic lens. If we gave Gilman full control over the meaning of that story, though, then our role, and honestly our fun as readers, would shrink considerably. We could still read the material, certainly, but reading would become a much more objective, closed down, and less stimulating activity. You would simply be hunting for the answer that the author had already determined, as though literature were an equation to be solved. When it comes down to it, literature is an interpretive discipline. It asks us to read, argue, test, and revise our interpretations according to the language on the page. And don't forget that literature couldn't exist in any meaningful way without readers. We are the ones who keep determining, debating, and revising the meaning of a text as time and culture continue to change. So when students keep asking for the final answer, the right answer, the official meaning of a piece of literature, I want to give them the best advice in literature there is. There is no final answer, at least not in the way students often want there to be, because everything is subject to interpretation, although some interpretations are going to be stronger and more persuasive than others. No matter what, you always need real textual evidence to support the interpretation you have. You can't simply say, this is the meaning of the text because I feel it is. You have to be able to back it up with evidence that comes from the text itself. Some interpretations will always be more compelling than others, but other interpretations are not automatically invalid as long as there is textual evidence to support them. So that's how I want my students to approach literature in my courses, and I encourage you to approach it that way too. Now, while I certainly give my students interpretations of a text, that doesn't mean those interpretations are the only ones or necessarily the right ones. One of the things that I base my courses on is discussion and challenge, because I do believe literature is something to be debated. And ironically enough, remember, while you read The Death of the Author, that Barthes, the writer of this essay, is also an author whose authority has died the minute you began reading him. So, share with me your ideas and thoughts on this theory, this essay, and how it might affect the way you approach literature, art, ideas, and anything subjective from here on out. Thank you so much for joining me as always, and be sure to check out some of my other videos for more help with literature, writing, research, and rhetoric. I'll see you guys there. Be well.